A kind stranger buys food for orphan girl. Her reaction leaves him speechless. The marketplace was alive with noise, a chaotic blend of voices, bartering, and the scent of fresh produce hanging in the warm air. Vendors called out to passers-by, advertising their goods with animated gestures, their hands moving as swiftly as their voices. Among the bustling crowd, no one noticed the small girl standing near the fruit stall. Her pink dress, faded and frayed at the edges, hung loosely on her thin frame. Her hands clutched a small, tattered coin purse, its fabric worn from years of use. Sophia didn't move. She just stared. A pile of fresh apples sat in front of her, glistening under the dim yellow market lights. She licked her cracked lips. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would taste like. The crisp bite, the sweetness filling her mouth, the way the juice would run down her fingers. Her stomach growled loudly. She flinched, immediately looking around, as if someone might have heard the sound and scolded her for being hungry. But no one paid her any attention. The vendor, a burly man with a thick mustache, was too busy talking to another customer to notice her hesitation. Sophia swallowed hard and forced herself to move forward. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her tiny purse, counting the coins inside. 3. That was all she had. She clutched them tightly and looked up at the vendor. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How much for one apple?" The man barely glanced at her. 5. Sophia's heart sank. She hesitated, shifting on her feet, looking down at the coins in her palm. I only have 3, she admitted. "Is there any way I could?" The vendor waved a hand, dismissing her. "No money, no fruit, kid. Move along." Her face burned. She nodded quickly and took a step back, pressing her lips together. Of course. It had been stupid to hope. She turned, her small hands curling into fists, and started walking away, but stopped when she heard a voice behind her. "I'll take 2 apples, please." Sophia froze. The voice was deep, kind, but unfamiliar. She turned slightly, just enough to see him. A man, tall with dark, wavy hair peppered with hints of gray, stood beside her, reaching into his wallet. He wore a simple flannel shirt, rolled up at the sleeves, and had the kind of presence that felt warm, steady. The vendor perked up immediately. "That'll be 10. The man handed him a bill without hesitation, then took 1 apple for himself and turned, crouching slightly to offer the other to Sophia. "Here," he said, holding it out. "This one's yours." Sophia stared at him. She didn't move, didn't breathe, because this didn't happen. No one just gave things to her. Her first instinct was suspicion. But what did he want? She glanced around, expecting someone to snatch the apple away or tell her it was some kind of cruel joke. But the man just waited. Patient. The apple rested in his large, calloused hand, its red skin shining under the market lights. Sophia's fingers twitched. Then, cautiously, she reached out and took it. Her hands shook slightly as she clutched the fruit close to her chest, as if someone might steal it away at any second. The man smiled. "See? No tricks." Sophia still didn't speak. She just held the apple, staring down at it like it was made of gold. The hunger inside her clawed at her ribs, but she didn't eat it right away. She was used to making food last, used to saving things because she never knew when she'd eat again. But the man's eyes were kind. He didn't rush her, didn't demand anything in return. That made something tighten in her chest. She took a small, careful bite. The taste exploded in her mouth. Perfect. Her throat ached as she swallowed, her stomach cramping slightly from the sudden food. She took another bite, and another, until she had devoured half of it, her fingers sticky with juice. The man chuckled. "Tastes good, huh?" Sophia nodded quickly, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. A beat of silence passed between them. "Thank you." Her voice was small but sincere. The man smiled. "It's just an apple." To him, maybe. To her? It was so much more. She hesitated, shifting on her feet. "Why did you do that?" The man shrugged. "You were hungry." Sophia frowned slightly. "Most people don't care." His smile faded, replaced by something softer. "Most people should." For the first time in a long time, Sophia didn't know what to say. She had met all kinds of people in the streets. People who looked away. People who sneered. People who told her to go home. But this man? This man had just seen her. And that was scarier than anything. She suddenly stepped back. "I have to go," she said quickly. The man blinked. "Are you okay?" Sophia nodded. "Yes. Thank you again." Then she turned on her heel and rushed into the crowd. Not because she didn't trust him, but because, for the first time in her life, someone had been kind to her. And that was too much. Sophia moved quickly through the marketplace, weaving between the crowds, her heart pounding. She wasn't running from danger. She was running from kindness. Because kindness wasn't normal in her world. It wasn't something she could trust. The apple was still in her hand, its sticky juice drying on her fingers. She wanted to devour the rest of it, but she forced herself to slow down. Make it last. Make it count. She had learned that lesson a long time ago. People thought hunger was just about food. But real hunger? The kind that settled into your bones? That was about survival. And Sophia had been surviving for as long as she could remember. She reached a narrow alleyway between two old buildings, her safe spot, and pressed her back against the rough brick wall, catching her breath. Her fingers tightened around the apple as she looked down at it. She had never tasted something so sweet. Never had something so freely given. Her stomach twisted, not from hunger this time, but from something worse. Something she couldn't name. Both things that had failed her before. She squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't think about that. She had to focus. Sophia? Her eyes snapped open. She turned instinctively, her body going rigid. Daniel stood at the entrance of the alleyway, hands in his pockets. She froze. How had he found her? How had he even followed her through the crowd? She had been so careful. Her heart pounded as she took a step back. "Relax," Daniel said gently, raising his hands. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." Sophia swallowed hard, her body still tense. "You shouldn't be here," she muttered. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "And why is that?" She didn't answer. She just looked past him, scanning the street. Looking for them. The people who might be watching. The ones she was running from. Daniel caught the shift in her expression. His brows furrowed. "Are you in trouble?" Sophia hesitated. No. Daniel didn't look convinced. "You're a terrible liar," he said, his tone light but firm. Sophia's fingers curled around the apple. She was used to lying. It was safer. It kept people out. But this man had already seen too much. And that scared her more than anything else. She turned away, staring at the wall. "Why are you following me?" she asked. Daniel sighed. "I wasn't following you." "I don't know. You ran off, and something didn't feel right." Sophia huffed out a laugh, shaking her head. "That's stupid." Daniel shrugged. "Maybe. But I've learned to trust my gut." Sophia exhaled, staring at the ground. There was a long, heavy pause. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Daniel asked. She tensed. She knew what he was really asking. "Are you homeless? Are you alone?" She wasn't sure why it made her chest tighten. But it did. She shook her head quickly. "I'm fine." Daniel didn't push. He just watched her for a moment before nodding. He said. "Then let me at least buy you dinner." Sophia's head snapped up. "No," she said immediately. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "Because." She hesitated. Because she wasn't used to this. Because no one had ever cared what happened to her after the moment passed. Because kindness like this always came with a price. But Daniel? Daniel just stood there. Patient. Unbothered by her hesitation. And that threw her off balance. She licked her lips. "I don't need anything." Daniel smiled slightly. "Everyone needs to eat." Sophia looked at the half-eaten apple in her hand. "Already did," she muttered. Daniel sighed. "Sophia, that's not a meal." She clenched her jaw. It was to her. Daniel must have noticed the shift in her expression, because his voice softened. "Look, I get it," he said. "You don't trust me. That's fine. But I'm not asking for anything. Just food. That's all." Sophia's fingers twitched. The smart thing to do was walk away. never see him again. But the thought of warm food made her stomach twist painfully. And the thought of being alone again made something even worse settle in her chest. A feeling she hated. A feeling she refused to name. Loneliness. She exhaled sharply. "Fine," she muttered. Daniel's smile widened, but he didn't say anything. He just turned, motioning for her to follow. Sophia hesitated one last time, then stepped forward. And for the first time in a long time, she let someone walk beside her. Sophia walked beside Daniel, her steps cautious, her body tense. The market noise had faded behind them, replaced by the steady hum of city life, cars rushing by, distant sirens wailing, the chatter of people who had no idea that her entire world had just shifted. She shouldn't be here. She shouldn't be letting this happen. But Daniel wasn't asking questions. He wasn't looking at her like she was broken. And that was dangerous. She kept her head down as they walked, clutching the remains of her apple, unsure if she would even eat again after this meal. They turned a corner, and suddenly, the scent of food filled her senses. Savory. Her stomach tightened painfully. Daniel pushed open the door to a small diner, the kind with old red booths and a flickering neon sign. It wasn't fancy, but it felt safe. Sophia hesitated just outside the entrance. The warmth, the normalcy, it felt foreign. Like she didn't belong. Daniel looked back, waiting. She swallowed hard and stepped inside. The moment she did, a young waitress with a tired smile greeted them. "Just the two of you?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, a table in the back if you've got one." The waitress grabbed 2 menus and led them to a quiet corner. Sophia slid into the booth slowly, feeling the soft cushion beneath her. It had been so long since she sat at an actual table that it felt wrong. Daniel sat across from her, acting like this was completely normal. Like he hadn't just pulled an orphan off the street and taken her to dinner. Like she was just another kid. The waitress handed them menus, and Sophia's eyes immediately scanned the prices. Everything was too much. Way more than she was worth. She clenched her fists. "I don't need much. Just water is fine." Daniel sighed. "Sophia." She didn't look up. "You're not just getting water." Her stomach twisted. "It's too expensive." Daniel set his menu down. "Don't worry about that." She hesitated. "But it's food, Sophia. That's all. No strings. No expectations." Her hands shook slightly. Because that was the part that didn't make sense. There were always strings. Always something people wanted in return. But Daniel? He just sat there, waiting. Finally, she exhaled and picked up the menu again. The waitress returned, flipping open her notepad. "What can I get you?" Daniel smiled. "I'll have the burger and fries." And for her, he paused, letting Sophia decide. She bit her lip. It felt wrong. But the hunger was louder than the guilt. She forced herself to say it. "Grilled cheese and soup?" The waitress scribbled it down and nodded. "Coming right up." Sophia set the menu down, staring at her hands. She felt exposed. Like this was some kind of test. But Daniel didn't push her to talk. Instead, he leaned back, watching her carefully. "So," he said lightly, "do you always run when people buy you food?" Sophia tensed. "I don't." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You did at the market?" Her fingers curled. "That's different." "Is it?" She hated that he was right. She hated that he had noticed in the first place. Sophia exhaled sharply. "I don't like owing people things." Daniel's expression softened. "You don't owe me anything." She stared at him, searching for the lie. But it wasn't there. And that scared her more than anything. The waitress returned with their food, setting a hot bowl of soup and a golden grilled cheese sandwich in front of Sophia. The smell was overwhelming. She could feel the warmth radiating off the plate, hear the faint crackle of the toasted bread. Her stomach clenched so hard she felt lightheaded. She lifted the sandwich with shaking hands and took a bite. It was perfect. Crispy. Cheesy. Warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Daniel watched her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. She ignored him and focused on her food. One bite, then another, and another, until her plate was almost empty, and for the first time in forever, she wasn't hungry. She let out a slow breath, setting her sandwich down. Daniel took a sip of his drink before speaking again. So, he said, "Want to tell me why you're really out here alone?" Sophia froze. There was the real question, the one she had been running from. She clenched her jaw, staring at the table. "I told you," she muttered. "I don't have anywhere to go." Daniel nodded slowly. "And why is that?" Silence. Sophia's fingers dug into the fabric of her dress. She didn't owe him this. She didn't owe anyone her story. But for some reason she wanted to say it. Her voice came out hollow. "My mom died." Daniel's face didn't change. He didn't react. Didn't apologize like most people did. He just listened. Sophia swallowed. "She got sick," she said. I don't even know what it was. One day she was fine. The next, she wasn't. She could still remember it. The shallow breaths. The way her mother tried to stay awake, even when her body was giving up. The way she had whispered, "Be strong, Sophia." And then, nothing. Daniel didn't speak. Sophia exhaled, forcing herself to keep going. "They took me to live with my uncle after that." Her voice wavered. "I thought it would be okay. But it wasn't." Daniel's expression darkened slightly. Sophia shrugged. "Didn't take long before I realized I was just another mouth to feed. He didn't care about me. He just wanted what little money the government gave him for taking me in." Daniel's hands tightened into fists. He started drinking, getting angry. One night she cut herself off, her heart hammering. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "You ran?" Sophia nodded, her throat tight. "Yeah. And I've been on my own ever since." The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Jesus, kid," he muttered. Sophia looked away. "I don't need pity," she snapped. Daniel shook his head. "It's not pity. It's just," he let out a breath. "That's a lot for someone your age." Sophia shrugged. "It's life." Daniel studied her for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. "You don't have to keep running, you know." Sophia let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah? And what am I supposed to do instead?" Daniel tapped his fingers against the table. "You could let someone help." Sophia's throat tightened. That wasn't an option. That was how people got hurt." She stood up abruptly. "I should go." Daniel sighed. "Sophia, thanks for the food," she muttered. "But I don't need anything else." She turned, heading for the door. But then, a shiver ran down her spine. She stopped just short of stepping outside. Her body went rigid. Because across the street, leaning against a car, was a man in a dark jacket. Watching her. A cold wave of fear crashed over her. No. They had found her. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. The man across the street was watching her, his posture too still, too deliberate. He wasn't just standing there. He was waiting. Her fingers curled around the edge of the door, her body frozen in place. This was bad. Really bad. She should have known they'd find her eventually. She had been too careful, staying out of sight, keeping to herself. But one mistake, one moment of weakness, was all it took. And now they were here. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. That was the only option. She started to turn, ready to bolt, but Daniel's voice cut through her panic. "Sophia?" She barely heard him. Her mind was already mapping the escape routes. Back door. Alley. Side street. She knew these roads. She could lose them if she moved fast enough. But before she could take a step, Daniel's hand gently touched her shoulder. It wasn't a grab. It wasn't forceful. But it stopped her cold. Because for the first time in a long time, someone had noticed she was afraid. Her muscles tensed under his touch, and she turned just enough to see the concern in his eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Because if she told him the truth, really told him the truth, he would be in danger too. She took a shaky breath, forcing her voice to stay even. "I have to go." Daniel frowned. "Sophia, talk to me." "I can't." She pulled away from him, stepping back, her pulse screaming at her to run. But it was too late. The man across the street had already started moving. She saw it in her peripheral vision. The way he straightened, the way he spoke into his phone, the way his posture shifted into something dangerous. He wasn't alone. And he wasn't going to let her leave. Daniel must have sensed the shift because his entire demeanor changed. His easygoing nature hardened. His eyes flickered toward the man approaching them, his jaw tightening. And then, he stepped in front of her. A shield. A wall between her and whoever was coming. Sophia's breath hitched. "What are you doing?" she whispered. Daniel didn't take his eyes off the man. "Keeping you from making a mistake." Sophia clenched her fists. "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think," Daniel muttered. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't his fight. He didn't know who they were. He didn't know what they were capable of. And yet, here he was, standing between her and danger like it was second nature. The man in the dark jacket was close now, just a few feet away. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of person who knew how to make himself a threat without saying a word. When he spoke, his voice was low and smooth. "Sophia," he said, ignoring Daniel completely. "It's time to go home." A chill ran down her spine. She knew that voice. Knew it too well. Her nails dug into her palms. "I don't have a home." The man tilted his head, lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You know that's not true." Daniel's stance shifted. His body squared, muscles taut, like he was preparing for something. Sophia hated how easily he had picked up on the danger. The man's gaze flickered to Daniel then, acknowledging him for the first time. "This doesn't concern you," he said flatly. Daniel didn't move. "It does now." A tense silence stretched between them. The man exhaled, like this was nothing more than an inconvenience. He reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately. Sophia tensed, ready to run. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a wallet. And a badge. Sophia's stomach dropped. No. It wasn't a real badge. She knew that much. But it looked real enough. And that was all that mattered. Fake credentials. Fake authority. The kind that made people step aside. The kind that made girls like her disappear. Daniel's jaw clenched. "Nice prop." The man's smirk deepened. "You don't want to get involved in this?" Daniel didn't budge. "Funny," he said. "Because I'm already involved." The air between them was thick. Sophia's hands were shaking, but she fought to keep them steady. She needed to move. Needed to act. She couldn't let this happen. Not again. Not like last time. But before she could react, before she could figure out how to fix this, the man took a slow step forward. "Step aside," he said. "This girl is coming with me." Daniel's voice was calm. Deadly calm. She said no. Sophia's breath caught. The man's expression flickered. Like he wasn't used to hearing that word. Like he wasn't used to people standing in his way. He studied Daniel for a long moment. Sizing him up. Calculating. Then he smiled. Like he had already won. "All right," he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Have it your way." And just like that, he turned and walked away. No fight. No threats. Just calm retreat. Which meant one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Daniel didn't move until the man disappeared down the street. Only then did he turn to Sophia. Who was that? Sophia's throat felt tight. Her pulse was racing. And suddenly, she wasn't hungry anymore. She looked up at Daniel, her voice barely a whisper. "The reason I can't go home." Daniel didn't press. Didn't demand answers. He just studied her. Then, finally, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Then we figure out what to do next." Sophia blinked. "What?" Daniel exhaled. "I'm not letting you go back to that. Whatever that was." Her chest tightened. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. People weren't supposed to care. But here he was. Standing beside her. Choosing to stay. And for the first time in forever, Sophia realized she wasn't alone anymore. Sophia stood frozen, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Daniel's words hung in the air between them. "Then we figure out what to do next." She didn't know what to say. No one had ever said that to her before. No one had ever stayed. She clenched her fists, trying to fight back the overwhelming feeling creeping up her throat. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to run. Disappear. Make sure they never caught her. But Daniel had complicated everything. He wasn't scared. He wasn't leaving. And that was dangerous. Sophia took a slow step back, shaking her head. You don't understand, she muttered. They won't stop. Daniel's expression was unreadable. Then neither will I. Her breath hitched. He said it so easily, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like protecting her was a given. She felt her chest tighten. You don't even know me. Daniel exhaled. I know enough. Sophia swallowed hard. This wasn't how it worked. People didn't just care. People didn't just help. She had learned that the hard way. And the sooner he realized that, the better. She squared her shoulders, forcing herself to be colder. I don't need your help. Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Sophia, just forget you saw me, she cut in, her voice sharper than she intended. Go back to your life. He didn't blink. Didn't move. Sophia, I saw the way you looked at that guy. You were terrified. She flinched at the word. Terrified. She hated how true it was. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Listen, I don't know the full story, and I'm not gonna force you to tell me, he said. But if you walk away right now, you know exactly what's gonna happen. She clenched her jaw. You're gonna keep running, he continued. And one day they're gonna catch up. Her stomach twisted. Because he was right. She knew he was right. But knowing it didn't make it easier. Didn't make the fear go away. She exhaled shakily. I don't have a choice, she whispered. Daniel's eyes softened. Yeah, you do, he said. You just haven't had anyone to tell you that before. Sophia stared at him, her pulse hammering. This was wrong. This was wrong. She didn't get to have choices. She just survived. She had spent so long believing that she didn't know how to do anything else. Daniel leaned back, giving her space. I'm not gonna make you stay, he said. If you want to run, go ahead. Her fingers twitched. Her body was screaming at her to leave. But her legs wouldn't move. Daniel's voice was quieter now. But if you're tired of running, he exhaled. Let me help. Sophia's breath hitched. She wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that there was another way. But trust? Trust got people hurt. She had trusted before. And it had cost her everything. Her throat tightened. I don't know how to stop, she admitted, barely above a whisper. Daniel gave a small, knowing nod. Then let's figure it out together. Sophia's fingers curled into fists. She hated how much she wanted to believe him. She hated how easy he made it sound. But mostly, she hated that for the first time in forever. She didn't feel alone. Sophia's heart pounded, her pulse a steady drum in her ears. The words hung between them, heavy and unfamiliar. Then let's figure it out together. No one had ever said that to her before. No one had ever offered her another option. For as long as she could remember, running had been the only way. Now, Daniel was standing here, telling her she didn't have to. And she didn't know what to do with that. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her dress, the tension in her body refusing to ease. Why? She finally asked. Daniel blinked. Why what? Why are you helping me? She whispered. Because it didn't make sense. People didn't just help without a reason. People didn't just stay. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair before leaning back against the diner booth. I don't know, he admitted. I just know I can't walk away. Sophia stiffened. You should, she muttered. Daniel shook his head. No, I shouldn't. She swallowed hard, feeling something press against her chest, tight and overwhelming. You don't know what you're getting into? Then tell me. Sophia's throat closed up. She couldn't. She couldn't say the words, couldn't relive the past. Because saying it out loud would make it real. And if it was real, then she'd have to face it. She turned her head, looking out the diner window. The man who had been following her was gone. But that didn't mean he wasn't out there. Watching. Waiting. Her stomach twisted, a wave of nausea creeping up her throat. She should leave. She should get up, run out the door, and disappear before it was too late. But her legs wouldn't move. Daniel watched her carefully, his patience unnerving. I don't need details, he said finally. But I need to know one thing. Sophia glanced at him warily. What? Are you in danger? The question landed like a stone in her gut. She had spent so long pretending that the answer was no, convincing herself that as long as she kept running, kept moving, they couldn't hurt her. But that wasn't true. And deep down, she had always known that. She swallowed past the lump in her throat and gave the only answer she could. Yes. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. All right, he said, his voice calmer than she expected. Then we need a plan. Sophia blinked. What? A plan? Daniel repeated. You can't keep running forever, Sophia. That's not a real solution. She laughed bitterly. It's worked so far. Daniel shook his head. No, it hasn't. If it had, that guy wouldn't have found you today. She flinched. Because he was right. Running had only delayed the inevitable. But she didn't know what else to do. Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious. Tell me about them, he said. Not everything. Just enough so I know what we're up against. Sophia hesitated. She had spent years keeping this secret, keeping herself safe. She had never told anyone. Not a single person. But Daniel had already seen too much. She licked her lips, her hands trembling slightly. They're not my family, she whispered. They act like they are. Like they're looking out for me. But they're lying. Daniel's jaw tightened. Who are they? Sophia hesitated. Bad people, she said finally. Daniel's expression darkened. How bad? She met his gaze, her voice barely audible. They killed my father. Silence. Daniel's fingers curled into fists. Sophia hadn't meant to say it. She hadn't meant to admit the truth. But once the words were out, she couldn't take them back. She waited for his reaction. For disbelief, for skepticism, for pity. But Daniel didn't do any of those things. He just sat there, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. Finally, he exhaled. He said. Sophia frowned. Okay? Daniel nodded. But so we figure this out. She blinked. Just like that? No questions? No telling her she was crazy? You believe me? She whispered. Daniel's gaze was steady. I believe you. Something inside her cracked. A feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Relief. It was small. Barely there. But it was real. And it scared her more than anything. Because if Daniel believed her, if he was really going to help, then for the first time in forever, she wasn't alone. Daniel ran a hand down his face. All right, first things first, we need to find somewhere safe. Sophia swallowed hard. There's no such thing. There is, Daniel countered. We just have to find it. She hesitated. Could she trust him? Could she really let someone help? The idea was terrifying. But what choice did she have? If she went back on the streets, they'd find her. If she tried to run again, they'd track her down. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. This was about finishing what her father started. She took a shaky breath. Okay, she whispered. Daniel nodded. Good. But first, we need to get out of here. Sophia frowned. Why? Daniel's expression darkened. Because that guy wasn't alone. Her stomach dropped. She turned, glancing toward the window. Two men stood near the street corner, their eyes scanning the area. Looking. Searching. Her chest tightened. They had sent more. Daniel stood up, pulling out a few bills and tossing them on the table. We're leaving. No. Sophia didn't argue. She knew what happened when they caught up to her. She grabbed her bag, shoving the rest of her sandwich into it. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, steering her toward the diner's back door. They slipped out into the alley, the air suddenly feeling too cold. Daniel's hand stayed firm on her shoulder. We're gonna be fine, he murmured. Just trust me. Sophia's throat tightened. She wanted to. But trust was dangerous. And for all she knew, it might get them both killed. Sophia's breath was shallow as she followed Daniel through the narrow alleyway, her feet light on the cracked pavement. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if it knew the danger lurking just around the corner. Daniel kept a steady pace, his hand lightly gripping her wrist, not to restrain, but to keep her close. She didn't fight it. Not this time. She knew what would happen if they got separated. Behind them, muffled voices carried over the hum of the city. Did you see her? She was right there. Check the diner. A sharp pang of panic shot through her ribs. They were too close. She clenched her fists, forcing her breathing to stay even. No sudden moves. No noise. Stay small. It was instinct by now. Daniel must have heard them too, because his grip on her wrist tightened slightly. They turned a corner, the alley splitting into two paths. Left, toward an open street. Too risky. Right, toward the dimly lit back of an old warehouse. Better cover. Daniel made the choice in a second, pulling her toward the right. Sophia followed without hesitation. The alley was lined with old dumpsters, the air thick with the scent of garbage and wet asphalt. It should have been disgusting. But right now, all she could think was, it was better than being caught. Daniel pressed a hand against a rusted metal door, testing it. But he muttered a curse under his breath. Sophia took a deep breath, forcing herself to think. There had to be another way out. Then she saw it. A stack of wooden pallets, leaning haphazardly against the warehouse wall, leading up to a fire escape ladder. She tugged on Daniel's sleeve, pointing. Daniel followed her gaze, his eyes scanning the makeshift path. Think you can climb it? She nodded without hesitation. She'd climbed worse. Daniel didn't question her. Go, he murmured. I'll be right behind you. Sophia moved fast. Her fingers gripped the wooden slats, her feet finding purchase on the uneven surfaces. The pallets wobbled beneath her, but she ignored it, pushing higher. When she reached the ladder, she grabbed the lowest rung and pulled herself up. Daniel followed close behind, his movements solid, controlled. They made it to the second floor, slipping through a half-broken window into the warehouse. Sophia landed lightly on the old concrete floor, her heart still hammering. Daniel climbed in after her, brushing dust off his jeans. For a moment, everything was silent. A loud slam echoed through the alley below. Sophia flinched. They're here, Daniel muttered. He moved quickly, guiding her deeper into the warehouse, his eyes scanning for an exit. The place was mostly empty, abandoned crates and broken machinery scattered across the floor. Sophia's breath came fast, but her mind was clearer now. She had escaped worse. She could do it again. Daniel found another door on the far end of the warehouse. He tested it, this time finding it unlocked. Come on, he whispered. They slipped through into another alley, quieter, darker. For now, they were safe. Sophia leaned against the wall, catching her breath. Daniel did the same, running a hand through his hair. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Daniel turned to her, his expression serious. Who are they? Sophia's chest tightened. She shook her head. You don't want to know. Daniel's jaw tensed. Yeah, I do. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. This wasn't just her fight anymore. She had dragged Daniel into it. He deserved to know what he was up against. She exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. They used to work for my father. Daniel frowned. Your father? Sophia nodded slowly. He wasn't just some guy, she admitted. He had information. About people. Bad people. Daniel stayed silent, letting her talk. Sophia's fingers curled into fists. When he realized what they were doing, he tried to stop them, she continued. He collected evidence. Documents. Everything. Daniel's expression darkened. And then, Sophia's throat tightened. They killed him. The words felt like knives on her tongue. Even after all these years, saying them still hurt. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. Jesus, kid, he muttered. Sophia looked away. I was supposed to disappear, she said. They thought I didn't know anything. That I was just a kid. Daniel's gaze sharpened. But you do know something, don't you? Sophia hesitated. Then, slowly she nodded. My dad left something behind, she admitted. Something they never found. Daniel frowned. What is it? She swallowed. I don't know exactly, she said. But it's big. Big enough that they're still looking for it. Daniel processed that for a moment. Then he sighed. You've been running ever since, haven't you? Sophia nodded. Daniel leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. All right, he said. Then we need to find it before they do. Sophia's eyes widened. What? Daniel gave her a steady look. "If your dad left something behind, we need to get to it first," he said. "Before they do." Sophia shook her head. "You don't understand. They're dangerous." Daniel's expression didn't waver. "Yeah," he said. "And so am I." Sophia froze. There was something about the way he said it. Unshaken. Like this wasn't new to him. Like he had seen things before. Sophia frowned. "Who are you?" Daniel smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Just a guy who doesn't like bullies," he said. Sophia narrowed her eyes. He was lying. Or at least, not telling the whole truth. But now wasn't the time to ask. Because deep down, she knew he was right. They had to find whatever her father left behind. Before it was too late. Sophia's pulse was still racing, but her mind had cleared. For years, she had been reacting, running, hiding, surviving. Now, for the first time, she had a plan. Sort of. Daniel's words still echoed in her head. "We need to find whatever your father left behind before they do." The problem was she had no idea where to start. She rubbed at her arms, trying to shake off the cold that had settled deep in her bones. Daniel watched her, his expression unreadable. She still didn't know who he really was. No ordinary guy just jumped into danger like this. No ordinary guy knew how to move like he did. She wanted to ask. Wanted to demand answers. But she didn't. Because deep down, she already knew. Daniel had his own secrets. And right now, those secrets were the least of her problems. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to focus. Think, Sophia. Where would her father have hidden something important? Somewhere they couldn't find it. Somewhere she would know to look. Her mind cycled through memories, bits and pieces, whispers of a life she had tried to forget. A flash of something. A conversation. "If anything ever happens to me, you remember, okay? You remember our place?" Her heart skipped a beat. The bookstore. It had been her favorite place as a kid. A tiny, hidden shop tucked between two buildings, filled with old paperbacks and the scent of ink. She and her father had gone there all the time. Could it be there? Was that what he meant? She swallowed hard. It was a long shot. But it was the only lead she had. She turned to Daniel. "I think I know where to look." His gaze sharpened. "Where?" She hesitated. "If I tell you, you have to promise something," she said. Daniel tilted his head. "What?" "If things go bad," Sophia whispered. "You don't stay." Daniel's expression darkened. "Sophia, I mean it." She straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to look him in the eye. "I don't need a hero," she said. "I need someone who will survive this." Daniel let out a slow breath, his jaw tight. "You're asking me to promise something I can't?" Sophia clenched her fists. "Then I'm not telling you where we're going." A beat of silence passed. Then, Daniel sighed. "Fine," he muttered. "But let's hope it doesn't come to that." Sophia nodded once. And with that, they moved. The bookstore. The city was different at night. The neon lights cast strange shadows, the air thick with the hum of distant traffic. Sophia and Daniel moved fast, keeping to the side streets, avoiding main roads. She knew they were still looking for her. And the longer they stayed in one place, the worse their chances got. Finally, they reached the bookstore. It looked just as she remembered. Small, wedged between two larger buildings, its sign faded with age. The windows were dark. No one had lived here in years. Sophia stepped forward, testing the door. "But, of course." Daniel glanced at her. "Can you get in?" Sophia smirked, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a thin piece of metal, a makeshift lockpick she had learned to use a long time ago. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Sophia shrugged. "You pick up skills when you don't have anywhere to sleep." She knelt, sliding the metal into the lock, twisting, listening for the click. Seconds passed. A soft pop. She pushed the door open. "Impressive," Daniel muttered. Sophia stepped inside, ignoring him. The air smelled like dust and old paper. Memories rushed back. Her father's voice, the way he used to let her sit behind the counter, the hours she spent lost in books. Her chest tightened. This place had been safe once. Now it was just another ghost. Daniel closed the door behind them, locking it. Where do we start? He asked. Sophia swallowed, stepping forward. She moved on instinct, past the empty shelves, toward the back. There had been a small office, tucked away where customers never went. Her father had spent hours there. She had never questioned it, but now she realized that had been his hiding place. She reached the door, tried the handle, but this time there was no key. Her stomach sank. Daniel stepped beside her. Move. She barely had time to react before he lifted his foot and kicked the door in. The old wood splintered, the lock snapping. Sophia stared. Daniel shrugged. No time for subtlety. She shook her head and stepped inside. The office was small, cluttered with old paperwork and forgotten files. But there, in the corner, a safe. Her breath caught. Daniel followed her gaze. You know the code? Sophia's fingers trembled as she knelt in front of it. She hoped she did. Her father had always used the same numbers. A date. Their date. She exhaled, pressing the buttons. 3-2-0-5. The safe clicked. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She reached out, pulled the door open. And inside, a small, leather-bound notebook. Sophia's fingers brushed the worn cover, her chest tight. She picked it up, flipping it open. Pages and pages of notes, names, locations. Evidence. Everything her father had been working on before they killed him. Her vision blurred. She had been right. It had been here all along. Daniel crouched beside her, his gaze scanning the pages. This is it, he murmured. This is what they're after. Sophia nodded slowly. But before she could speak, a noise. A loud bang. Her stomach dropped. They had found them. Daniel moved fast, grabbing the notebook and tucking it into his jacket. Back door? He asked. Sophia nodded, shoving down her panic. She led him through the office, to a narrow hallway that opened into an alley. They stepped outside, into the cold night air, and stopped short. 3 men stood at the exit, waiting. Sophia's heart slammed against her ribs. The leader stepped forward, smirking. Going somewhere? Daniel's body tensed beside her. Sophia clenched her fists. No more running. Not this time. The man grinned, pulling a gun from his jacket. You should have stayed lost, kid. Sophia's fingers tightened around the notebook. Her father had died for this. And if she had to fight for it, so be it. Sophia's pulse thundered in her ears. The gun gleamed under the dim alley light, its presence suffocating. The man holding it, Mason, was someone she had seen before. One of them. One of the men who had worked for her father before turning on him. He smirked, his finger resting lazily on the trigger. You really should have stayed hidden, kid, he repeated, tilting his head. Sophia forced herself to stay calm. She had known this moment would come. It was inevitable. But she hadn't expected Daniel to be standing beside her when it did. She could feel the tension radiating off him, his body coiled tight like a spring. Mason shifted his attention to Daniel, his smirk deepening. And who's this? He asked, amused. Your bodyguard? Daniel didn't react. Didn't flinch. He just studied Mason with cold calculation. Mason sighed, shaking his head. Listen, kid, he said, turning back to Sophia. I don't want to make a mess here. Just hand over the notebook, and we'll forget this ever happened. Sophia's grip on the notebook tightened. Forget? He really thought she would just hand over the last piece of her father's legacy? After everything? Her jaw clenched. Go to hell, she spat. Mason's smirk vanished. The air thickened. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice colder now. Sophia's stomach twisted, but she didn't back down. Daniel exhaled slowly. You guys really should pick better lies, he said. Mason's gaze flickered toward him again, irritation flashing in his eyes. And why is that? Daniel gave a small, humorless chuckle. Because the only way this ends is with you getting that notebook over my dead body, he said, his voice calm, steady, certain. Mason's smirk returned. That can be arranged. His finger twitched on the trigger. Sophia's breath caught, and then Daniel moved. Faster than she thought possible. 1 second he was beside her. The next he was lunging. His hand knocked Mason's wrist aside, sending the gunshot into the air. Bang! The sound echoed through the alley, deafening. Daniel's fist slammed into Mason's face, sending him stumbling back. The other two men reacted immediately, lunging forward. Sophia's heart raced. She had to move. She couldn't just stand there. She clutched the notebook and ran. Not away. Around. She ducked low, weaving through the fight, her body moving on pure survival instinct. Mason recovered, swinging wildly at Daniel. Daniel dodged, driving his elbow into Mason's gut. One of the other men grabbed a knife, lunging. Daniel caught his wrist, twisting hard, a sickening crack. The man screamed, his knife clattering to the ground. Sophia reached the side of the alley, her mind racing. She needed a way out. A distraction. Something. Then she saw it. An old metal fire escape ladder. It was loose, hanging just above reach. She didn't think. She jumped, grabbing onto the lowest rung. The ladder groaned under her weight. Then it collapsed downward, crashing onto the men below. Mason barely had time to react before the metal slammed into him, knocking him off balance. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sophia's wrist. Go! They ran. Feet pounding against the pavement, breath sharp and ragged. The alley opened onto a side street, headlights flashing past. Sophia didn't stop. Didn't look back. She could hear Mason yelling, his voice furious. But they had a head start. And for now, that was enough. An abandoned safe house. Sophia and Daniel didn't stop running until they were deep into the city's industrial district. The streets were empty, silent. Only then did Daniel slow, glancing around before leading her toward a rundown auto shop. He punched in a code on a rusted door panel. The lock clicked. Sophia blinked. What? Daniel pulled her inside. The door shut behind them. Sophia turned, scanning the space. The auto shop was clearly abandoned, but there were signs of life. A cot in the corner, a few supplies stacked on a crate. This was a safe house. Her stomach twisted. Who are you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. Not important right now. Not important? She repeated, her voice rising. You just dragged me into your secret safe house, and you expect me to believe you're just some random good guy? Daniel leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. I never said I was random, he said. Sophia scowled. Then start talking, she demanded. Daniel exhaled. You first. Sophia froze. What? Daniel gestured toward the notebook still clutched in her hands. We need to know what's in that, he said. Because right now, those guys are tearing the city apart looking for it. Sophia hesitated. She had spent years keeping this secret. But Daniel had risked his life for her. Maybe he deserved the truth. Her fingers shook slightly as she opened the notebook, flipping through the pages. Handwritten notes. Coordinates. Names. Documents that could destroy powerful people. Her father had uncovered something big. Bigger than she had ever imagined. Her chest tightened. This is why they killed him, she whispered. Daniel leaned over, scanning the pages. His expression darkened. This isn't just evidence, he muttered. This is a kill list. Sophia's stomach dropped. A kill list? She scanned the names. And then, her breath hitched. One name stood out. Her father's. And right below it, her own. She stared. Cold fear curled around her spine. They were going to kill me too, she whispered. Daniel clenched his jaw. Yeah, he said. But now? Now they know you have this? Sophia's fingers curled around the pages. They had stolen everything from her. Her home. Her family. Her childhood. And now they wanted to erase her completely. Not this time. She looked up, her expression hardening. I'm done running. Daniel studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Good, he said. Because if we're going to end this, we need a plan. Sophia took a deep breath, her hands still shaking. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She was angry. And that meant they had already lost.